Hi, welcome to this panel titled Strategic Competition Beyond Earth, the Politics of Outer Space Security. My name is Sarah Dunn. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Leicester and a visiting scholar at George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. Competition in space is not a new topic. My thesis on Soviet and Russian anti-satellite weapons begins in the late 1950s when competition between the US and USSR moved into space. Nevertheless, competition in space has evolved and continues to evolve as new technologies are developed and as more countries and private companies participate in the domain. Space is now often described as being congested and contested, with over 80 countries and hundreds of companies contributing to the roughly 13,000 active payloads currently in orbit. Beyond the difficulties of space operations, actors face numerous challenges, both old and new, from space traffic management to orbital debris and the threats of ground-based and space-based counter-space capabilities. The possibilities and perils of space are increasingly mainstream discussions, especially due to developments such as the Ukrainian use of commercial space systems and the subsequent Russian jamming efforts in the Russo-Ukrainian War. We'll be discussing the topic with our distinguished panelists, whose expertise ranges from international law to military space strategy. To introduce our panel, we are joined by Dr. Blevin Bowen, who is Associate Professor of Astropolitics and Co-Director of the Space Research Center at Durham University, who has shared his expertise in military space strategy and politics through extensive publications and advising and briefing government agencies such as the UK Ministry of Defense, ESA, and the Japanese Cabinet Office. Victoria Sampson is the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability at the Secure World Foundation. She plays an active role in international space governance and security issues, both through her work at Secure World and through roles such as serving as the chair of the International Astronautical Federation's Security Task Force. Marilyn van Delen serves as the EU Special Envoy for Space, with a background in non-proliferation and disarmament. As Special Envoy, she represents the EU in multilateral forums to promote responsible space behavior and has operational responsibility as to the response to threats to the EU space program. Professor Yun Zhao is the Henry Cheng Professor in International Law and Associate Dean Mainland Affairs of the University of Hong Kong's Faculty of Law, with extensive publications and experience in space law, dispute resolution, and international economic law. I'll now turn to our panelists to hear their views on some of the challenges we face in space today regarding long-term orbital stability, connected to strategic competition, as well as potential solutions. So starting with Blevin, as more countries and private companies develop space capabilities and participate in the domain, what impact does this have on space governance, and how does it affect the political and military considerations of the quote-unquote traditional space powers such as the US, China, and Japan?
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks for putting the panel together, and thanks to the organisers for bringing me to this conference day, and thank you for turning up at 9 a.m. as well. So thank you very much. I'll try not to disappoint or set you off back to sleep. So yeah, just a few thoughts on that starter question. And I guess as an academic, I'll do some myth busting possibly in response to that question. Don't worry, I won't get hung up too much on concepts and theory at this time in the morning. But yes, the rise of commercial space actors, or a new commercial space age, or a second space age dominated by commercial actors, these are common refrains that we see in a lot of the discourse, a lot of think tank reports, many politicians and practitioners, military and civil say these things. So now, it is true there is a lot more private provision of services in space now. There's a lot more private companies existing in space, or in the space economy, rather. They don't literally exist in space. They're not based in space yet. But the space economy does look much more private than it did, say, compared to 50 years ago. However, we shouldn't confuse private ownership with a private economy. So I'm not aware of a single space company that would exist without public funding. So if you're studying the political economy, you cannot ignore the role of the state still. So when it comes to governance and private companies or private industry's impact on it, it's the same it's always been. It's about that relationship between the state or the public sector and private industry in carrying out state policies, state contracts, or making sure that they don't go against the foreign policies, industrial policies, and security policies of the governments or the states that they are registered within or do business with. So in that sense, in terms of political economy, there's nothing new under the sun there. Yes, there is a lot more private economy, but there's no fundamental political and social and economic shift there. It's still private companies chasing government contracts. So that's a simplification, but it is, I think, the ground truth we have to operate from. So now it's interesting, there's a lot more innovation, you could argue, in that a lot more private actors are now trying to come up with products they think governments want to buy, rather than governments just setting out exactly what they want and then contracting out services. But those are getting into the weeds of the discussion, not the big picture. So we'll just start with that big picture today. So when we talk about the wider impacts onto Japan and the United States and all space powers, really, we're just seeing, I think, just a continuing entrenchment of the already established space powers. So it's the United States that has the biggest, most dynamic private space industry. Now, it's never fully separate from state and military industry either, but that private industry, I think, is only strengthening US industrial capacity. Whether China is able to compete with that, we'll see in the next 20, 30 years or so, but that can't be divorced from wider political and economic structures and supply chains either. Space industry is very dependent on critical mineral resources and rare earths, which is a fascination of a certain head of state at the moment. So what leverage other powers can bring to that in the supply chains will affect space as well. But you can see that the biggest space companies are already in the most industrialized powers, and they fit into the wider political and military networks that they exist as well. So I'm not too concerned about corporations in space going against the wishes of the states, because often their interests are aligned or go hand in glove, or they complement each other, whether that's through deliberate policy or elite self-interest, either way. But as a politics and international relations academic, for me, it's business as usual in terms of power politics and the space industry. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And for Victoria, the Secure World Foundation has noted that orbital debris removal and uniform debris standards are critical for space safety and sustainability. Beyond the technical difficulties, what are the challenges of debris removal from an international governance perspective, especially given the necessary involvement of private actors, and what is the need for orbital debris standards?
Sure, thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I know it's introduced. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm with the Secure World Foundation. Thank you to the organizers for bringing me here and for getting me on this panel. This is my first time at this conference, so just maybe a quick introduction as to my organization. We're a US-based nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to, usable for all over the long term. Now, you may be wondering why we're talking about space debris in a conference on arms control and non-proliferation disarmament. It's just that anything that can destabilize the space environment can have long-term strategic consequences, and space debris absolutely can play that role. Right now, there's about 54,000 objects being tracked that are larger than 10 centimeters in diameter. Of those, there are about 13,600 active satellites. So then you have about between 1 to 10 centimeters in diameter, there's about 1.2 million pieces of debris that we think are being tracked. And then there's an estimated 140 million pieces of debris that are 1 millimeter, 1 centimeter. So why does this matter? Based on the speeds that we're looking at in Earth orbit, even a very small piece of debris can have very large consequences. Now, the ones that are bigger than 10 centimeters, we mostly can see. And so in theory, you can do maneuvers or things like that to avoid them. Things that are between 1 millimeter and 1 centimeter, okay, that can maybe pock your satellite, but it's not going to fully damage it. It's the ones you're not too sure about, 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters, those can have long-term devastating consequences. And right now, we don't have any way to get rid of space debris. What happens is eventually it comes back down. Now the question is, how long does that take? My degree is in political science, so big picture, oversimplify. The higher up it is, the longer it takes to come back down. So if you have stuff in low Earth orbit, it's at about 550 kilometers, it'll come back down and burn up in this atmosphere in about 25 years or so. But if it's higher, it will stay up longer. So, for example, the debris from China's 2007 ASAT test was about 880 kilometers. Oh, sure. The debris at China's 2007 anti-satellite test was about 880 kilometers. And that's still up there. It'll probably be up there decades, if not a century or more. And again, the higher up it is, the longer it'll be up there. So as I said, right now there's no way to remove debris from orbit. There are a lot of companies and countries working on doing this sort of thing. Northrop Grumman has a thing called space logistics, where they've sent up mission extension vehicles to satellites, 2 of them, in geostationary orbit, which is at 36,000 kilometers in altitude. And basically what they do is they put a little engine on, for all intents and purposes, an attitude control system and a propulsion system to extend the life of the vehicles. China in 2022 sent a satellite up to geostationary orbit to remove another dead satellite to get it out of the way. So we've had that happen. In theory, we think that China refueled 2 satellites in geostationary orbit in June, but we're not sure exactly. But still, right now, it's hard to say. So because of the damage debris can create and because it can be destabilizing, the best picture is not to create it in the first place. So for example, the US in 2022 made a commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests, largely because of the debris that's been created. Now, my organization, the Secure World Foundation, puts out an annual global counterspace threat assessment. We look at counterspace capabilities around the world, and one of the things we do is we track debris from these anti-satellite tests. So throughout the history of the space age, 1968, that was the first debris-causing anti-satellite test. There's about 6,800 pieces of debris that were created. Again, trackable pieces of debris, which means there's probably a lot more that's untrackable. Of that 6,800 pieces of debris that were created, over 2,900 are still around. Some of the biggest debris-causing incidents were done during anti-satellite tests. So that's part of the impetus, I think, for the US and other countries to make this commitment. As well, Russia in November 2021 had an anti-satellite test where they shot down one of their own satellites, created about 1,800 pieces of trackable debris. So the US and now 38 countries in total have made this commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests, and now it's a mouthful because it's not talking about not developing the capability, but just not testing that capability. 38 countries have done it as well and made this commitment, I should say, including all members of the European Union. There was a UN General Assembly resolution in 2022 where 155 countries voted in support of this. So you can see there's kind of a norm emerging that's considered bad form to deliberately create debris in orbit. Now, the issue is why also is there a concern about, are there policy consequences for developing these kind of debris removal technologies? And the thing is, oftentimes you'll hear someone say, oh, any satellite can be a weapon. And no, that's not how it works. You can't just drive a satellite into another satellite. Basically, satellites are going in circles, they're going in orbits. However, if you are developing a satellite that can do active debris removal, that is to say you're developing a satellite that can maneuver and get up close to another satellite, it can be doing that for many reasons. It can be doing that to get debris out of the way. But it could also be doing it to do something else. We call military rendezvous and proximity operations, or RPO activities. My organization counts military RPO activities as a co-orbital counterspace threat capability, with the idea that the system gets up into orbit and then does whatever it's going to do. Now, you can be getting up close to another satellite to take pictures of it. You could be going up close to it to listen to what it's listening to. You could go up close to it to jam what it's listening to or what it's broadcasting. You could be doing it to mess with its optical sensor. You could be getting up close to release objects at a low velocity. You could be getting up close to release objects at high velocity. We just don't know. It's very hard to demonstrate intention. It's more the technologies we're looking at. And so that's why it's a concern from a strategic viewpoint. These ADR, these active debris removal technologies, can have consequences for strategic stability. And so, like I said, I mentioned earlier, China did it in January 2022. They sent their satellite, the SJ-21, up to geostationary orbit. They had a satellite there that was dead. It was shedding pieces of debris. And so basically what they did is they pulled it from geostationary orbit to a really high, what's called graveyard orbit, where it's going to be out of the way. For all intents and purposes, it's there forever. Now, you can look at it and say, look, China was a responsible space actor. They had a satellite that was causing a hazard at a very highly regulated, very important orbit like GEO. Or you could look at it and say, China has demonstrated they have a co-orbital capability, that they can get up close to another uncooperative satellite and pull it out of its way. So imagine that's a concern there from ADR technologies. in terms of like, what are the, you ask about like best practices and guidelines and standards. There are some international agreements in terms of, okay, how do you not create debris on orbit, just from regular space flight activities. There's, there's the International Agency for Debris Coordination, the IADC, that has debris mitigation guidelines. The UN has had long-term sustainability agreements that basically talks about minimizing creation debris through regular operations. Of course, I'm talking to Europeans. ESA has a zero debris charter with the idea of not creating debris in orbit by 2030. India has also made a commitment to have debris-free operations by 2030. So there are some activities where actors are, they recognize we do not want to create hazards in an orbit that we ourselves have to operate in. The commercial sector has also been doing a lot of best practices. And this is also the idea that, okay, if you want to operate in these environments, it's to your bottom line that it's a good idea not to create difficulties. Every time you have to maneuver on orbit, you're causing yourself to have to spend fuel, which means you're shortening your lifespan, which means the actual thing that's getting you money, you're going to get less of that. So there's all sorts of, the Space Safety Coalition, all sorts of best practices are being done there. They're not legal, but I mean, once you have these best practices that are understood, countries can take them down to the national level and put them through legislation and make them legally responsible at that point. But in terms of, looking at, best practices overall, the idea is it's considered good form to have end-of-life plans for your satellite when you launch it. Right now, the best practice is within 25 years of end of operations, you should do something like either bring your satellite back down or send it up to a graveyard orbit. The thinking now is that's too long, maybe 5 years. The very large constellations, it's even shorter than that. But the concern I have from a strategic viewpoint is that with the rise particularly of very large constellations, we have the possibility for a space traffic coordinated issue to escalate into a conflict. And specifically, I'm talking about the US-China relationship. For me, it just always comes back to that when you're looking about strategic stability in space, because you have two nuclear-armed rivals operating in very similar orbits. I'm speaking specifically about Starlink, SpaceX's Starlink, which is a US company. Right now, there's about, I have to keep track, they keep launching twice a week, but roughly, I think, 8,900 active satellites. They're looking at having at about 15,000 right now, satellites, at about 550 kilometers, but they've asked for spectrum for 30,000 more, so we're looking tens of thousands of satellites. They're at altitude about 550 kilometers. Now, China just started launching their own versions of Starlink. They have a government-owned version and a commercial-owned version. They just started last year, so they're only about 200, but they also want each of those to be about 15,000 satellites. Their constellation is going to be operating at higher altitude, so at about 1,000 kilometers or so, but they have to get through Starlink to get there. And so you can see if there's not a common understanding for best practices or how to share information or how there's going to be a close approach, how do you communicate with the others, then you could see, okay, you could have an incident where some satellites hit each other and may be perceived as a deliberate threat. And that can have really good consequences, very strong consequences for strategic stability. So with that, I think I'll stop, spend my time, and look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. And turning to Marilyn, as the EU Special Envoy, you represent a major economic power which prioritizes multilateralism over military dominance in space, but also notes the need to protect and defend against threats in EU-owned space systems. How can a framework like the EU Space Strategy for Security and Defense effectively influence and moderate strategic competition in space? What unique leverage does the EU hold to enforce norms?
All right, thanks very much for that question, Sarah. And I'm happy to be here and to see such a packed room at 9 in the morning. So that I think that's very good. So on our side, we've come quite a long way. In 2022, we had the strategic compass where we first identified space as a strategic domain. And out of that came the space strategy for security and defense. So this was really a paradigm shift and a change in the premise that first we increasingly rely on space assets and services for our economies, our societies, but they're also very important for security and defense. And therefore, we recognize that more measures are needed to defend the EU's strategic interests and to deter hostile activities in and from space. So this strategy that we have makes it clear that we are ready to protect and defend ourselves. It outlines 5 pillars, all of which should contribute to that end. And 3 of those are within my mandate. It's about a space threat landscape, so setting out the threats, responding to space threats, and partnering for responsible behaviors in outer space. And then the European Commission, who manages the EU space program, works on enhancing the resilience and protection of the EU space program, as well as enhancing the use of space for security and defense. Now, of course, in the EU, we all work together on these issues, so they're not exclusive competences of the different parts of the EU, but this is more or less where the leads are. So it's really important to realize that space security can be realized through different means, various means. We need to work on all of those fronts. On the one hand, we're making sure that we're in a position to respond to space threats, while also enhancing the use of space for security and defense. And on the other hand, we are increasing our engagements with third states on space security in order to promote responsible behavior in space. For us, it's really clear that to maintain and enhance space security, we need a strong cooperation with third countries. So strengthening the use of space for security and defense does not come to the detriment of our engagement with partners. That's something that sometimes people think, oh, you're all focusing on your own security and defense. That's not how it works. As EU, we need our partners and we want to cooperate with our partners. So over the past couple of years, we've expanded the number of dialogues and cooperation that we have with third states. One of the most recent ones is with Korea, South Korea. But actually, the day after tomorrow, we're going to have our first one with India, on space and space security. So that's very exciting work, and there's more of those in the pipeline. Also, I want to mention here our partnering with UNIDIR. I'm very happy that we were able to contribute to their space security program. I see 2 colleagues smiling here in the room, one from UNIDIR and one from FBI that's worked with us to make that happen, because we really want to support UNIDIR's efforts to work with third states, with all countries around the world, to develop this concept of responsible behavior in outer space. We try to do that as much as we can as EU bilaterally, but with the help of UNIDIR, I think we can reach many more people, and we can benefit from the research that they do. In the EU, we have continuously stressed that outer space as a global commons must remain free from conflict for exploration and use by all states without discrimination. So because of that, we continue to actively promote a safe, secure, stable, and sustainable space environment and the peaceful use of outer space on an equitable and mutually acceptable basis for all. You can hear about my use of words that this is why we really want to work with third countries, because we need to support them in making sure they have the access to space, also for future generations. If they're not spacefaring nations now, they might want to become so, or even if they don't, third countries use space services every day. Everybody does. On your phones, on your GPS, in banking, in agriculture, it's omnipresent. That's for that reason we've really promoted in the UN context to make sure that we have a large number of countries that are involved in the issue of maintaining space safe and secure for everyone to operate in. And the most important vehicle for that right now is the open-ended working group on PAROS in all its aspects. PAROS, preventing an arms race in outer space, for those that are not yet space aficionados in the room. So we really try to get those discussions to be inclusive. An open-ended working group is much more inclusive than a GGE or the Conference on Disarmament, where not the whole membership of the EU is represented, of the UN is represented. So that is something that we've really worked for. But then coming to the question, what leverage do we hold as EU? Well, we are a permanent observer as EU in the UN. So we participate in the open-ended working group on perils and all aspects. Or we participate in UN General Assembly, First Committee, in COPUOS. And these are places where we can promote the EU's common position, that is the position of all our 27 member states on perils in all its aspects. We're very active there. We speak, we engage with third countries. We will also present working papers. If you check out the UN website, you'll see 2 working papers that we presented just last July in the first operational session of the Open Working Group, one on threats and one on the legal framework. I've mentioned threats. Just want to say that we have our annual space threat landscape, which is a classified document. It's written by with input from the security services of all our member states. But what Victoria just mentioned about threats we face in space, it very much resonates with that. I think that is generally what we're looking at. And because of the nature of those threats, and I think Victoria explained very well, it is what you do with your assets, what that matters, that makes it turns it into a weapon potentially or not, especially systems designed for active space debris removal. That is why we focus on norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior more than on a traditional arms control setting of counting nuclear weapons and missiles, for example, or doing inspections in chemical factories. That doesn't work in space. Space is very different in that respect. On our response, just 2 words. If you read the strategy, you'll see that we've committed to improving the EU response to any attacks to the EU space system. We're working on that with our member states. We hope to get our aim is to get a toolbox with mostly diplomatic tools, right? The EU is not a military actor as such, but diplomatic tools, of which we have quite a few. But I hope to be able to say more about that if I'm invited again next year. So I'll stop here, otherwise you will not invite me again next year.
Thank you so much. And Frian, as noted, while competition in space is not new, it is evolving. Given that the foundational treaties governing outer space were drafted in a different era, most specifically the Outer Space Treaty, which is from 1967, are there areas where the current international legal framework is insufficiently equipped for modern strategic competition? Where's the most critical gap, and how can it practically be closed?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, indeed. I think when we look at the current space legal framework, I think it's quite clear that all the space treaties, the 5 space treaties, were established or concluded during 1960s to 1970s. With the first Outer Space Treaty in 1967, the last treaty, Moon Agreement, was concluded in 1979. When we look into the 60s or 1970s, there were only 2 superpowers. So they are the main players at the time. It's quite clear at the time most people believe that the states are only the actor for the space activities, no private entities and no individuals involved. So that's why if we look into the 5 space treaties, they only take into account the needs of the states. So that means we look into the activities carried out by the state. But in the 1980s, we found out that more and more private entities are interested and involved. That means the space commercialization and privatization came out in the 1980s. But since 1980s, we do not really see a lot of space treaties coming up. Of course, this also shows that the difficulties in the negotiation of space treaties. So obviously, we can say that the 5 space treaties are not enough, not sufficient to deal with the current situation. But if we look into the provisions, the principles put down in the Outer Space Treaty, for example, the non-appropriation principle, peaceful uses for outer space principle, etc., all these are very important principles which continue to exist or continue to apply. But new problems, new issues come up. So if we look into the major new issues, I think probably I can think of, for example, the space commercialization, the privatization. Firstly, regarding the emergence of private actors, private entities. So how to regulate the activities by these private entities? What can we do? So that's one major issue we will have to look into. The second issue regarding the space commercialization, in particular when we look into space mining, we know that the United States has already had the Artemis Accords, which signed with more than 50 countries already. China also has a ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station Agreement. So all these proposals were put forward and put into practice. So what can we do regarding the space mining? If we look at the unilateral level, we found out that the United States started by making the national legislation in 2015, to be followed by Japan, UAE, and Luxembourg. So at the moment, the 4 national laws have made it very clear that it's possible for private entities or private individuals to have the ownership of the mining that were brought back to the earth. But we know that in October 2015, when the United States released national legislation, 2 months later, in December 2015, the International Institute of Space Law issued a declaration saying that, of course, I think if we examine the rules, the provisions that were put down in the 2015 legislation, obviously, the United States has complied with its international obligation, but we have to seriously consider whether this is the most ideal situation. So that's a unilateral approach, whether it's good or not. I think that we have to put a question mark over there. In a bilateral level, we know Artemis Accords, the United States have reached these kind of agreements with other countries. This is kind of a similar model regarding the agreement, IGA, Intergovernmental Agreement for the International Space Station. So this kind of approach has also been used. But if we also look into other approach, the multilateral approach, which has been advocated by several other countries, for example, we have the Hague Working Group on the space mining issue, but more importantly, the UN Corpus has also set up the working group. This year have already issued the second version of the documents regarding the space mining. So that is a second issue, which I think is rather important. The third issue, we look into the military use of outer space. I think we have to first of all look at the Outer Space Treaty. Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty put down the several 2 paragraphs regarding the peaceful uses for outer space. But if we look into the first paragraph, it only mentioned about prohibition of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. It does not really cover a conventional weapon. So what can we do? I think that's the first paragraph. The second paragraph is good. It mentioned about the inclusive peaceful use of outer space. It's good, but if we compare with other treaties, for example, if we look into the Antarctica Treaty, it prohibits all measures and measures of military nature. So what can we do, or can we still improve the current legal regime or not? So I think that's a starting point. We look into the peaceful uses for outer space or military use of outer space. But with the further developments, with the technological developments, we found out there are also issues about the dual-use nature. How can we differentiate the civil use or military use? I think this is proves to be the difficulty in the use of outer space. I think that what can we do? I think probably we have to come up with some guidelines or not. Probably I think now the international society community is talking about the issue. But we also look into the another issue regarding the anti-satellite satellite issues. So it's a test ASAT. I think what can we do? I think that we have some discussions about the ASAT from probably in the 2007, 2007, 8, 9, or even afterwards. Whether it's legal or illegal, I think it's clear that the international legal regime does not provide a very clear answer. It does not say legal, illegal. So, but it's quite clear that we can do something better. We probably can also refer to Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which mentioned about the contamination, harmful contamination. It talk about the due regard and consultation, etc., or notification principle. So what can we do? What kind of legal regime can we come up with? So all these should be under discussion or negotiation. So that is the third issue I can think of. The fourth issue, I think, as Victoria also has mentioned about the space debris, I think no doubt space debris is one of the major issues. What can we do for the space debris mitigation? Of course, the IADC and also UN Corpus has already issued the guidelines regarding the space debris mitigation, no problem. But these are non-binding legal documents. So what can we do? How do we improve the situation? Moreover, if we look into the UN Corpus Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, this document was concluded under the STS, the Scientific and Technological Subcommittee of the UN Corpus. From the legal point of view, what can we do? So I think there are quite a lot of issues that we will need to look into. Now, with all these issues, I think I just named just a few. What can we do? How can we help to close the gap? I think first of all, I think if we talk about the hard law or international conventions, I don't really think it's very realistic in the near future. In the CD, Conference on Disarmament, China and Russia co-sponsored the documents of perils for prohibition of weapons orbiting in orbit, etc. peril. But obviously, this have faced a lot of challenges, difficulties. But the UK and also other member states also put forward some soft law approach. I believe in the short run, soft law approach might be more feasible, more practical, but we should be open to include various approaches to realize a peaceful use of outer space. And I think the very good chance is that international society have agreed to put the hard law and soft law negotiation in different working groups. We should be open. We should be open-minded to look into which will be the way forward. We will try to come up with some rules, at least to guide the use of outer space. So I think that's a soft law approach could be something we will be have to emphasize. That's one. Second approach, I think we probably also look into the self-regulation, with more and more private entities coming into the arena. I think it's rather good. I think not only we look into the government regulation, but we also should consider the industry self-regulation. Self-regulation will be very useful. The companies themselves will have some financial interest, benefits in the space activities. So they will form their own rules to facilitate the space activities. But at the same time, we wouldn't say that pure self-regulation will be ideal. We probably will also need to think about the governmental intervention, or the intergovernmental organization can intervene in the whole process. That means self-regulation will be good if private entities are involved in space activity, but government intervention or IO intervention will be helpful, will be in a position to ensure that all these self-regulatory rules will be adequate or ethical. So I think that's the second. The third, of course, very importantly, about the international cooperation. The principle has been put on in the UNGA since 1958, 1 year after the launch of the first man-made satellite. But for a long time, if we look into the principle of international cooperation, there's only one sentence in the UNGA resolution in various documents. But fortunately, in 1996, the UNGA issued a resolution which lists several conditions regarding the use of international cooperation principle. They look into not only the formal aspect, but also substantive aspect. Formal aspects basically means that you can take various forms of cooperation, bilateral, multilateral, global cooperation in various few areas, in governmental areas, academic areas, so that formal aspect. When it comes to the substantive aspect, the document also mentions that the most important principle is party autonomy. That means the member states, the countries are free to decide whom to cooperate, which country to cooperate, how to cooperate, the areas to cooperate, etc. Second, it also mentioned about the international cooperation should be carried out on an equal and non-discriminatory basis. Third, it also mentioned about such cooperation should take into account the particular needs or special needs of developing countries. So I think this 1996 UNG resolution indeed provides some kind of guidance regarding the international cooperation. But it's not enough. In 2010 or some years later, the UN Corps also set up a working group to study how to push forward international cooperation. So there are already some kind of proposals or suggestions put forward how to promote, advocate international cooperation. So I think that's something I think will probably can be used to close a gap. I think that's missing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask the panel a question before we turn to the audience Q&A. This is something that has been mentioned, the increasing utilization of dual-use commercial satellites in military operations is a highly discussed subject. Are there currently sufficient international legal frameworks to address this issue, both regarding the legality of actions against commercial systems and regarding financial responsibility? Now, who wants to jump in first?
I mean, in a word, no, there's not. But the question we're into is, again, these commercial assets are being used more and more often in military missions, but they're also being used by civilians. And so, for example, Starlink, which is being used by the Ukrainian military for communication, is also being used by millions of people around the world for satellite-based internet. And so when you look at it, you say, okay, if it's being used in a conflict, then yes, it is a lawful target. But just because it's a lawful target does not mean you can just go after it. There's still the international humanitarian law still applies, so you have to meet the principles of distinction, proportionality, of military necessity, things like that. But that's one of the big questions. I will point out that both the U.S. Space Force and the U.S. Department of Defense put out commercial integration strategies last year to say, okay, here's how we're going to try and bring them into our use. The Space Force created what's called Commercial Augmentation Space Reserve, with the idea that if there's a time of conflict, they could tap into space capabilities. But one of the questions is always indemnification. If you're a commercial company and your stuff is being used by the U.S. military in a military conflict, and you get targeted and you get financial consequences, how do you deal with that? And the U.S. hasn't quite figured it out. I will say NATO put out a commercial integration strategy this past summer, and they said, yes, we do need to think about that, but they didn't really get very specific. So I think we're really in the early stages of that. But it's going to be, as we see more and more actors incorporating commercial capabilities into national security missions, I think it's going to be an issue that's going to become more and more relevant.
Thanks. I agree with what Victoria's been saying, and I guess I would just add that larger context of militaries, governments have always used dual-use systems. At least in the first world, the capitalist world, civilian and then commercial uses were embedded into many systems that were also configured as essential for state power and military power services. So you can look at the earliest Intelsat and Inmarsat satellite communication systems. They were sold on a commercial basis around the world, but they were also the backbone for a lot of less secure government and military comms as well. And this is no different to a lot of terrestrial infrastructure, which is used by civil and military authorities anyway. So the problems in space are not unique to space. And civilians are killed all the time in actual wars. And the infrastructures that civilians rely on are also targeted. So it's the same political problem that we're dealing with in space, and the same questions of power. And we have the ideals of the laws of war and ethics in war. And it's the judgment calls made by the militaries, their rules of engagement, that ultimately matter. because they'll be interpreted in the same way as they are on the ground. There's also the political consequences of taking such actions as well. So what are the practical effects and what is the political blowback of hitting certain kinds of infrastructures over others? Because some will be far more damaging to attack or disrupt than others. But depending on the political situation, it might well be worth it. How seriously do you want to win this particular war? Yeah, well, you might want to take down all of GPS to do it if it means you get Taiwan. Might be worth it, so long as a nuclear war doesn't happen. But those are the sorts of calculations that war planners and strategists are dealing with. And these are not unique, because you'll be having the same questions about ports and shipping and civilian shipping, energy supplies as well. So just putting that in that larger political context, if you're dealing with these issues outside of space, you'll probably be able to contribute to the space discussions as well if you're dealing with ethics of war and civilian targeting in war. Thanks.
Yes, I basically agree, I think, with the views I think that expressed. I think, first of all, I think I believe, I think if we look into the Outer Space Treaty, it's fine. I think the current international documents, agreements will continue to apply, including the United Nations charters regarding self-defense, etc. But we also find out some kind of dilemmas or difficulties in applying the current legal regime. One issue is regarding the understanding of a peaceful use of the outer space. I think how to understand the term peacefulness. We are talking about non-aggressive or non-military use. So I think that's the first issue. But of course, now we can find out more and more countries are using the non-aggressiveness. So I think that's fine. I think what I discussed. The second issue, I think we also just listen to the views regarding the use of international humanitarian law. Sometimes the principles, the fundamental principles, are very good. I think, for example, the distinction principle, proportionality principle, etc., continue to apply. But the problem is, how do we apply? It proves to be rather difficult. Distinction. How do we distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects? So I think that is because of the dual-use nature. So I think that's a starting point to think about. When it comes to proportionality test, how do we define the proportionality? The dual-use nature of the satellite can be used for military purposes, but also for civil purposes. It can also lead to very serious damages to civil use if we destroy the dual-use satellites. So how do we really define on the proportionality? But also, of course, precautions principle also causes some problem. So that means, I think, we all agree that the existing international principles can apply in the IHL, continue to apply. But how? The difficulty lies in how do we apply these principles. That's the second issue. The third issue that I can think of is about the liability issue. Liability, how do we define on the liability? If we look into the 1972 Liability Convention. The Liability Convention put down the two types of liability, absolute liability and fault-based liability. But we know, I think we do not really have clear rules regarding the duty of care. So how to define the duty of care? Probably we will need to look into some rules regarding the space traffic management or space debris mitigation. I mean, the hard laws. If it's just the guidelines, might not be able to hold the state accountable. So there's no conventions, no binding documents regarding these kind of actions or duties. That will be another difficulties in applying the existing laws or rules. So I think that I can complement. Thank you.
I agree with basically everything that's been said. I don't have too much to add, but I just want to point out it's really hard in a multilateral context to convince other states that international law, and especially international humanitarian law, apply to space. We set it out in a working paper that I just mentioned, but especially international humanitarian law, we're not getting that in the documents. And one of the arguments that we hear is that by referring to the applicability of international humanitarian law, you somehow admit that there is a potential for a war or a conflict in space, and therefore we should not. So that is something that we struggle with, because I think in order to address a number of these issues, the baseline is existing international law and international humanitarian law. I fully agree we need more for the specific nature of space. So there's a whole academic community here. If anyone wants to write something on that, that will be very welcome.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we'll now turn to audience Q&A. I don't know if we have a floating microphone or if one needs to be passed. Yeah. Oh, I think they wanted to catch it on the recording, so I can come. All right. Well, I think we saw your hand first. Just pass. Yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you very much for that discussion. That was really interesting. My name is Meerte Bekkers. I'm an analyst at NoSpace and affiliated with the Freeman Aerospace Institute at King's College London. Question for Marjolein, I suppose. Aware that EU is not ESA, but still curious to hear your thoughts on what you hope to see at the ESA Team 25 to, I guess, make sure that the EU stays or becomes, depending on your perspective, a credible space power.
I'd really like to see ESA to be a very strong organization. I think it's exceptional in the quality of its work. The EU space program is working closely with ESA, especially Copernicus, Galileo. They implement that. So it is in our interest that ESA keeps that quality of its operations. That's all I can say, because we're not at the table in the ESA ministerial, but of course there is a large overlap between the member states of the EU and the member states of ESA.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Kiara. I'm a policy intern at BASIC. Not a space expert at all, but very much interested in this field. You've talked a lot about dual use, but it is my understanding that there's also dual purpose, and there's a difference in that. Could you shed light on that? I don't know if there's a legal defined definition or not. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. So that allows me to flog a publication that my organization, the Secure World Foundation, worked on with UNIDIR. A few years ago, we put out what we call the Space Security Lexicon, with the idea that having observed these discussions at multilateral levels on issues on space security, there seemed to be difference of, not even just in terms of how to make space more secure and stable, but even what the terms meant that were being used in negotiations. So for example, in English, there's a difference between safety and security, but in a lot of other languages, there is not. Which can be a challenge, because the United Nations divides discussions on space security issues, the Conference of Disarmament and First Committee, and they do space safety issues at Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS, and Fourth Committee. So we said, okay, we got together a group of subject matter experts fluent in all 6 official UN languages, and we said, okay, here's what sort of terms we need to work on. The first section is acronyms, and basically the idea that, okay, these are common acronyms that are used, and we all more or less agree with that part. Even though we published it, almost immediately I got an email from a country being like, we don't agree with this one acronym, and that could have been helpful earlier, but thanks, guys. The second section is short, and it says, okay, here's a list of words that are used or phrases that we all mostly agree upon. And then the longer section, and that's the one I think that's where it's going to come in, is like, hey, these are terms that come up a lot as not necessarily agreement, and that's where dual use versus dual purpose comes in. Now, this works off of the research of UNIDIR analyst Almudena Azcárate-Coyote, who does a lot of work on this. And the idea is that dual use means that it's actually built to be used 2 ways, right? GPS is built to do military, PNT, position navigation and timing type stuff, but also it's being used by, farmers for planting and things like that. Dual purpose is the idea that it can be built for one thing but repurposed for another. Now, this is not a legal definition, but this is kind of okay. If you're trying to, discuss nuances and this sort of thing, actually it's almost more helpful. The concern really is dual purpose, that you might have a capability that's developed, as I mentioned earlier, for active debris removal, but then it gets repurposed into a military RPO activity or some sort of core orbital capability. Again, having said that, there's not a lot of legal agreements on these sort of things. The Space Security Lexicon has been translated into all 6 official UN languages and is available on UNIDIR's website. I recommend checking it out. They've done great work on that. And yeah, thanks for letting me bring that up.
Thank you. My name is Carlo Trezza from Italy. I was the former Italian ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament. And that's, in that capacity, we dealt very much with Paros and all these issues. But my first question, goes to Bedin. You said that the US are at the forefront, pole position in space activities, and yet they have difficulties in launching launchers. They don't have enough launchers to pursue their activity, if I'm not wrong. No? Well, I thought so. To Victoria, the debris. I think that it is thanks to debris, in fact, that we don't have an active weaponization in outer space. So that the idea of removing debris, we should be very cautious, because then maybe the situation would be more critical. And to Marjolin, 10 years ago, or a little bit in 2000, around 2010, the European Union launched a Code of Conduct initiative, which didn't really have a success. Is the Union thinking of something different or coming back to that initiative? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I would disagree with the characterization of the problem. The United States has far more launch capacity than anyone else in the world put together still at this point. I think last year the United States and the various companies within it together launched over 150 launches, so more satellites were launched than that, of course. And China, I think you're looking at maybe 50 launches last year, thereabouts, something like that. And then nobody then comes close to China. So if you have a bar chart, you have the United States all the way up here, China's about halfway down, and then everyone else is like right down at the bottom of the page. And that's Russia, Europe, Japan, India, doesn't really come close to China or the United States. Now, whether if they have enough launch capacity, that's a different question. But they are still launching far more than anyone else. But it's not, if they do have a bottleneck in capacity of launch, it's not as bad as perhaps, say, Japan right now. Japan wants to roll out a lot more intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and communication satellites for military purposes. They have a very, very well-equipped terrestrial military force with a lot of long-range precision weapons, but they are totally dependent on American satellite networks for their targeting. Their space security initiative in 2023 is all about building a Japanese target deck building capability for hitting mainland Chinese targets with zero American interference or withdrawal of support at the 11th hour, which sadly we've seen them do in Ukraine. So they are going to want to launch dozens of satellites every year in the forthcoming years to build those constellations for the military. The Japanese H3 rocket has nowhere near the cadence, the frequency of launch, and they're not building enough of these rockets to launch all of these satellites. They're going to have to go to foreign suppliers unless they drastically change their entire launcher industry. So America's in a far better position than anyone else in the world right now. China is the only competitor to the US in terms of the number of launches, the number of rockets, the diversity of launch capabilities as well.
I would agree. The only difference I would make is that, for example, SpaceX is launching, China's launching a lot, but they're not launching other countries' satellites, really. They're doing a little bit, but not really. Whereas SpaceX is launching, when they stand up Starlinks, they'll also send up maybe 20 or 30 other actor satellites. And so, for example, in the summer of 2024, there's a problem with their Falcon 9 launch vehicle. And so they had to put a hold on launches just for a couple weeks, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks while they figured it out. That set back this chain of satellites not being launched, military and commercial, for countries all around the world. I was talking to an Indian colleague of mine, and he was like, yeah, we were supposed to have our satellite launched in January, but it got pushed back 3 months because SpaceX was the thing. Now, so that's the issue, I think, in terms of large amounts at one time. But you're completely right. I mean, India has the PSLV, that's one of the launch vehicles that can do a lot of launches at one time. And India last year, I think maybe did a total of maybe 7 or 8 launches. And I think they're probably third in terms of launching. Yeah, so it's really a limit there. But in terms of, taking out debris would mean that people would want to weaponize space. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that at all. The reason why we have not seen space being actually weaponized is during the Cold War, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union tested anti-satellite weapons, but only, a few dozen each time. And you look at how many, the U.S. did 1,000 nuclear tests during the Cold War. But it was seen as so, anti-satellite tests, taking out space capabilities was seen as so destabilizing that the concern was that it would lead to nuclear conflict. With the idea that the U.S. mostly, but the Soviet Union to a lesser extent, depends so heavily on space capabilities for nuclear command and control. The idea is that there's some sort of interference with those satellites, then that would be precursor to nuclear conflict. And so that countries would have to respond immediately and assume that. So that was what was keeping the peace, frankly. Cold War was keeping the peace. Now, the idea that if you take out debris, no one is the most ardent supporters of debris removal, the most enthusiast new space actors, the ones that are just itching to get venture capital, give them money. No one is promising that they are going to develop a technology that can take out thousands of pieces of debris at one time. So no one is thinking, okay, just because we have ADR technology, we can also just pollute the environment willy-nilly, ignoring the legal consequences of doing so, the legal ramifications, or soft law ramifications, I should say. Just because, best case scenario, people are looking at getting maybe 1 or 2 pieces, big pieces of debris. Or they're looking at maybe getting small pieces of debris, but maybe a dozen at one time. No one is looking at getting thousands of pieces of debris. So I think it's good to look at removing debris. I don't think that's going to immediately lead to weaponization of space.
Marilyn and Yun, do you have any responses to the questions?
Yeah, I had a specific question on the EU Code of Conduct, which I think was ahead of its time. Time was not right for it right then, but if you look at the processes that are ongoing right now and the discussions, you see a lot of the same elements being discussed in a much broader context. So the EU is really signed up to participate in that broader context, so we're not going to put our own code of conduct on the table, but we are putting working papers and contributions to the current debate on the table. But yes, sometimes we read back our old documents and think, hey, there's some elements there that are still relevant and that we think have a lot of support.
Thank you. This is Sıtkı Egeli from İzmir University of Economics. The question goes to Victoria. Interesting information about the small and micro satellites and the new large constellations being placed in orbit. Of course, that's something we have been following with interest as well, among other things, like there are a number of Turkish startups as well with their eyes on launching their Internet of Things constellations starting from next year with SpaceX, by the way. In this respect, the question is, from the perspective of space situational awareness, in the event we somehow have this seamless, spotless SSA, and at some point, thereby we can issue warnings for the collision avoidance to the operators. Do those small and micro satellites have the built-in capability to maneuver, to change their orbit? I mean, or are there any norms, regulations, not norms, I've not come across with, but regulations or COC for the small satellite operators for adding this capability to maneuver once in orbit? I mean, are there any thinking about that? Thank you.
Yeah, the thinking is now that if you're a responsible space actor, you should have the ability to maneuver in orbit. But the question, and if you look at the draft EU space law, they do mention that as something to look into. The thing is, maneuvering in orbit doesn't necessarily mean propulsion. That's what a lot of people think. You need to have a satellite that can do propulsion. But that, can add weight and be technically complex. But there's other things you can use, like solar sails, to be able to change your position in orbit, and that's not, it's maneuvering, but it's not propulsion. So the thinking is at some point you may require that or something along those lines, but it's not required right now. And again, when you're talking about democratization of access to space, there's always a fine line between making it, a sustainable environment for all operators, but also putting in these burdensome regulations on new actors. So trying to thread that needle to find the best way in which to do that. Having said that, I think people do agree that you do need to have satellites that are big enough to track, because there are some microsatellites that are so small they're untrackable. In fact, a few years ago, there was a satellite constellation called Swarm in the United States. Now, in the U.S., when you launch, you have to get spectrum license. If you're a commercial actor, you have to get spectrum licensing from the FCC. And as part of your spectrum licensing, you have to say, okay, here's our end-of-life plans, and then you have to notify the FAA that you're going to be doing this. When Swarm went to ask for the licensing from the U.S. government agencies, the FAA took one look at it and like, you're too small to track. You can't launch. Swarm said later on that they assumed that they were going to get permission, so they were going to be launched by the Indians and on the PSLV, and so the Indians launched it. And FAA a few months later was like, "What? We didn't say you could launch it." Indians like, "Hey, that's your house. Get an order. We didn't have anything to do with this." And so Swarm was hit with like a $900,000 fine, which frankly they're a very wealthy company. It didn't do much, but just to say, hey, this is something to be thinking about in the future. But yeah, they're starting to think like, what are the best practices? What are the rules of the road? If you get a notification that your satellite is going to be, getting close to another actor satellite, and you both can maneuver, which is not always the case, but say that happens, who moves? Is it the bigger satellite? Is it the older satellite? Is it the more experienced space operator? And how do you share information about that? Right now, I think the only understanding I'm aware of is that NASA and SpaceX made an agreement where SpaceX said, okay, if we come close to one of your satellites, we'll maneuver because we have our autonomous maneuvering capability anyways. But obviously, that's not a doable long-term solution to make SpaceX make agreements with every other actor. I will say, right now, in terms of communication, satellite operators don't always know who to contact. I know one company, Rogue Space, they actually have on their website, if you have a potential close approach with one of our satellites, here's who to contact. Here's an email and a phone number. We will be monitoring this 24/7. Because a lot of companies, we've had situations where they get notifications about close approaches, and it's on a weekend, and well, we didn't check our email until Monday, so hopefully nothing happened. So they're trying to get hey, this is a 24-hour, 24/7 operation. I think one change that I've seen recently is that, particularly again with the rise of Chinese commercial large constellations, the concern, as I said earlier, is that a U.S. operator may have a close approach that could lead to an inadvertent escalation. And so the Department of Defense, I will not call it the Department of War, the Department of Defense put out recommendations, principles, and guidelines for U.S. commercial actors and say, okay, if you have to do maneuvering for a Chinese actor, here's the sort of things we want you to do. If you do A, you have to contact B and C. And if you have to do this sort of thing, here's who to contact. And basically saying, we're not putting a regulation because they didn't have to go through all this. But they said, look, these are just what we recommend you do, the best practices. And then DoD actually sent these guidelines to the Chinese as well and said, hey, we're not saying you guys have to do this, but here's what we're telling our people. And apparently it's helped improve communication a little bit. Just this is done in August. So in the past couple months, there have already been a couple circumstances where there's been a discussion about a close approach, and just going, hey, we think we're going to get close to you. Can you move? No. Can you move? Yes. And the Chinese have also reached out to NASA about this. There was discussions about this just a month or so ago. So we're starting to see the needle sort of flick a little bit on that, but I think there's a lot of work to go on that. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Sorin Popa, and I work for the European Commission. I'm not a space specialist either. I'm working on different matters, one of them being protection of critical infrastructure. So I look at space sometimes from this perspective. I have a question. We discussed a lot about China, Russia, and the United States and so on, but is there a risk that we might see actually non-state actors being a threat to the, let's say, maybe I should move far away from the, sorry for that. I was wondering if there is a risk actually of seeing non-state actors
The risk of non-state actors becoming threats to space capabilities. Was that your question?
because now there might be or might not be a state behind them. You know, we see a lot of hybrid threats now, and I know that for a non-state actor launching anti-satellite weapons, it's maybe far-fetched, but you can have, for instance, cyber attacks. And working on critical infrastructure, some people say that space assets are actually very vulnerable to this because of the radio frequency, which is a vulnerability, and some of them are outdated. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yes, it's the possibilities there. I mean, but also I know I sound like a broken record at this point. In the political and social and strategic universe, that wouldn't be new or remarkable. Private actors do war all the time. We have private military companies. Logistics chains on Earth for militaries are riddled with private companies, the private supply of the means of war. So in the social political universe, yeah, and
I can maybe expand on that. So again, my organization, the Secure World Foundation, we put out a global counterspace threat assessment where we look at 5 different kinds of counterspace capabilities, 2 of which are applicable exactly to what you're talking about. One is jamming, electronic warfare. Basically, everyone jams. You do not have to be a state actor. You can get anything off the internet. You can jam things very easily. And so, yeah, that is a concern because you see that happening. And 2, the other thing we look at are cyber counterspace capabilities, exactly what you're talking about. They have a non-state actor launching some sort of a cyber attack. And we see this happen as frequently. It's kind of a challenge, to be honest. My organization, we don't have clearances. It's unclassified. It's really challenging to get information about that sort of, in an unclassified setting. But we do see it happening, more and more. Again, though, as Ludden said, that's not unusual. For example, a lot of times there's jamming done by non-state actors, but they're being done in service of another actor, a state actor. And I would say cyber is absolutely one of those situations where we see a lot of that as well. So, I mean, the thing with cyber, not so much with jamming, but cyber in particular, it's hard to do attribution. I mean, you can get a pretty good sense of this sort of thing, but there's always plausible deniability, and that's why cyber is such an attractive option. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, they launched a cyber attack against Viasat's ground terminals in order to interfere with Ukrainian military communication. We all know they did it. The EU and the US came out a few months later and said Russia did it. Russia to this day has never acknowledged it. They've always denied it. So, I mean, that's the challenge when you're trying to figure out, and sometimes you just can't attribute, or it may take a while. I remember when Stuxnet, the one that went off the Iranian nuclear facilities, it took the better part of a year to be able to figure out who was actually behind that. So that's a complication as well. So yeah, it is definitely a concern. I think the thing that I get asked a lot about space terrorism, like no one is launching a satellite, as you said, the possibility of launching your own ASAT or launching your own satellite that's going to take over another actor satellite, that's not likely. But cyber counter space capabilities to interfere with the actual communication, basically people always think of space concerns or threats are only to the objects in orbit. And sure, the satellites are a huge part of that, but you have to have your ground station, you have to have your users, you have to have the communication between all 3. Anything that can interfere with those things are counter space capability. Non-state actors can obviously interfere with all those, so it is something to think about.
If I can just add, I didn't mean to finish on the yes and point. But non-state actors still have to exist somewhere. And they will exist in some jurisdiction somewhere. Now, with less intensive or less disruptive or less destructive actions like cyber intrusions or nuisance attacks or things like that, when it comes to questions of war and security, the burden of proof is actually, I would say, lower for states acting in a crisis, where, yes, we all know the Russians did the Viasat thing. We all know that. We all know who did Stuxnet. Those things happen, and there's an interest with all states to make sure that they don't have rogue actors within them, whether they're private sector or whether they're within the state and various factions within the state, to make sure nobody gets too far off the leash of whoever's in charge of defense, security, and foreign policy or crisis management at the time. But if private companies do start doing things that certain other powerful countries or states don't want them to do, then any assets can be seized within certain jurisdictions, sanctions can be imposed. If you have a rogue actor within your own territory, you can arrest people, you can kill them, you can strip them of citizenship, you can do a lot to people. That's the power of the state. And you can see in many countries right now how capitalist elites are bending the knee to political authority left, right, and centre.
Yeah, I think probably I supplement a bit, I think, from the legal point of view. We have to go back to look at the Outer Space Treaty. I think Article 6 mentioned about the state responsibility. The state should be held responsible for all activities carried out by governmental entities and also non-governmental entities. So that's a starting point. Then based on this provision, that means the state, when licensing the activities by non-state entities, they will have to be very careful regarding the issuance of a permit or licensing, including the possible liability issue, compensation, indemnification, and also the environmental impact, feasibility, etc. So that means, I think, at the international level, the state should be still held responsible or liable for anything that might come up. But internally, the state can still seek indemnification or other issues from the non-governmental entities. So that is the point. But also, of course, I think when it comes to the international level, talk about the state responsibility, we also can refer to the documents drafted by the ILC, International Law Commission, the draft articles on state responsibility. Although this is a draft article, it has been considered to be a customary international law, which will be binding on all the countries. So I think that's probably something to look at. So yeah, thank you.
We have time for one or two more, or probably 2 or 3 more questions.
Unless I'm getting at the feedback.
I think unfortunately there's only one way to find out.
Okay, here goes. I'm just curious, and again, I come from a very non-specialist space background. Can you comment on nuclear propulsion in space? How does that fit into all of this? We've got nuclear, micro reactors in space, which, how does that all fit in? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's important to distinguish between nuclear propulsion and nuclear power. So nuclear propulsion is using nuclear technology to propel an object as an engine to move around. So to have an electric motor, but it's powered by a nuclear reactor to give it thrust. And that is different to having a power plant on a satellite that is just a nuclear reactor. So you can look at ROSAT, old Soviet radar satellites in the 1970s. They were powered by a nuclear power plant, but they didn't have a nuclear engine for propulsion. More outlandish sci-fi concepts for space flight include nuclear electric propulsion systems, which I can't remember the exact science now, but it's about getting chemical reactions in a very small fuel bank through using high electricity and heat output from a nuclear reaction to give it thrust as well. The US Space Force has talked about wanting some kind of nuclear propulsion to make satellites more maneuverable. You have more efficient fuel to weight ratios, etc. And nuclear power plants for satellites, I mean, they only make sense really if you're in a place where solar power generation is not that good. So only if you're, in Carl Sagan territory, if you're doing like a Voyager, deep solar system or extrasolar kind of activity where the solar power that you get is so terrible, that's when you need like a nuclear battery or something like that. Perhaps if we have bases on the moon, and again, solar power isn't enough, or you spend long times in the shadow, like every fortnight on the moon, a nuclear generator might be useful there. But the danger, if we want to start putting more nuclear material on satellites, is when the launch, what if the launch goes wrong? You're going to spew all sorts of radioactive stuff and other dangerous substances, not necessarily radioactive, over a launch area. And anyway, it might cover if a launch goes wrong. So there's all sorts of problems there. Then there's the danger in orbit. I don't like the idea of having hundreds of military satellites that could be interfered with or disrupted in all the methods we've been talking about today, and something goes wrong, and then you've created a radiation hazard in certain parts of orbit that then degrade the electronics of loads of other satellites around it. And then there's the debris and bringing things down, or the disposal of the satellite. It's like, well done, we've got enough problems with nuclear waste on the planet. Now you've put it in orbit in 0G. Well done, that's even worse of a problem. So there's the disposal question. And then, depending where it is, if it comes back down through the atmosphere, well done, you've got radioactive waste burning up through the atmosphere that's going to land somewhere. And one of the old Soviet Rosats landed in Canada, crash landed in Canada in the 1970s. And it's one of the few occasions the liability convention has been used for space stuff. So, and the Canadians got some compensation from that as it spewed radioactive waste over Nunavut, I think, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, I'm not a fan.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. I think the Soviets, they sent them a $3 million check, but they refused to say they were liable. They're like, we're just not going to admit to it. I mean, yeah, for deep space scientific research, it makes sense. As Bledden said, China and Russia, they've got the International Lunar Research Station that Jan brought up, with the idea that they're going to have a permanently crewed mission on the moon starting in 2035. And one of those things they do include is a nuclear reactor, just because, again, the moon, you have 2 weeks of sunlight and 2 weeks of nothing. So they say if you're going to have people there, you're going to need a nuclear reactor to be able to have power. And the U.S. is saying, oh, actually, maybe we need to have a nuclear reactor on the moon as well, but they haven't really made a lot of progress on it. So, I mean, it's a concern from a proliferation viewpoint as long as they're handling this stuff properly. But it's kind of a challenge, again, as we evolve our use of space, these mores and norms are going to have to evolve as well.
Yes, I think the nuclear power sources are believed to be one of the most appropriate power sources for space activities. So as early as 1992, the United Nations UNGA has issued a resolution regarding the use of nuclear power source MPS. So it provides several very important guidelines regarding the safe and secure use of nuclear powers. And we have also mentioned nothing about some incidents, but the former Soviet Union incident, I think that's only one. Incidents which was widely considered to have used the liability convention dispute resolution mechanism, but the Soviet Union and also Canada refused to acknowledge the use of liability convention because they settled the issues through negotiation. So that's the issue. Now the international society is looking to the 1992 UNGA resolution, whether it's sufficient or not. So they believe that probably in the near future we need to have a hard law or convention regarding the use of NPS for space activities. So that's the discussion ongoing at the international level. If we look into the deep space exploration or the lunar exploration, it's quite interesting. I think a few months ago, I think produced an article regarding possibly in the future we need to have a lunar-centric or cislunar-centric legal regime instead of the current legal regime. Because now when we talk about the space law, we're looking at the laws with the Earth as the centric, that's the Earth-centric legal rules. But for future lunar activities, probably we have to think about the cis-lunar-centric legal regime. That means I think actually a lot of rules can be more stricter when it comes to the peaceful use of the outer space and also the sustainable use of outer space. So that will be something that we will need to look into. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I also reviewed an article, a very interesting article, which looks into the investment in building the road on the moon. So what kind of traffic rules should be used for the traffic rules on the moon if they invest on the moon to build the roads? So I think that will be something I think we have to look into. What will be the rule? We are not only talking about the traditional concept of space traffic management, but we are looking into the cis-lunar or lunar-centric part of the rules. So I think that could be interesting, I think, which we probably will have to explore a little bit further in future.
Just to add that this space nuclear nexus is a really interesting area of work. Also, the debate what laws apply to space, the nuclear safety and security debate. How does that translate? But there's also the broader strategic stability debate. There's of course the role of space in command and control of nuclear weapons. But also the fact that space is now becoming such a strategic domain in itself. It plays a role in the strategic stability equation. So these are very interesting crossovers, I think, between domains. The one thing, and I don't think it was mentioned yet, is the news that came out a year ago about Russia developing a nuclear weapon that can be put in orbit, which would be in contravention of the Outer Space Treaty, obviously, which would have very severe consequences if it were to be indeed put in orbit, just by being there. But even worse, if were actually to be detonated, because that would basically render unusable a whole part of the orbits that we now use for our daily lives. So there's a lot of interaction between the two fields, and I think it's a really interesting topic to look at.
I think unfortunately we have 1 minute left, so I think we'll. Yeah. Is there one last quick question back?
My name is Oscar Proust. I'm from Arms Control and Global Order Research Unit in Halle. I just have a question to Professor Zhao. Could you quickly elaborate on what is the perceived biggest threat for China regarding outer space? Is it the non-application of international law, or is it the military use of satellites? And I have another question for Ms. van Dalen. You said that you need support from academia to write something. Could you specify on what? On the legal aspects or the political dimensions? Or yeah.
1 minute or less.
Yes, well, respond very quickly. Thank you very much. I think when it comes to the Chinese situation, I think probably some of you still remember the 2007, 2008, I think, attack of, destroy the satellite, which causes a lot of space debris. But very quickly, I think we can find that the international society, of course, mentioned that this might not be the right way to do. But the British government also mentioned that they did not find any violation of international law. But the major issue is that how to do it better. So that is really something to do with the Outer Space Treaty, Article 9 issue, how to try to avoid harmful contamination. So very quickly, we found out that after the issue of UN Corporate Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, the Chinese government issued the administrative regulation at the national level regarding the space debris mitigation regulations, which largely adopted the international rules. So that means, on the one hand, we found out that at the current stage, no international binding legal documents on such issues, but very, very importantly, the international legal rules will provide some guidelines for the national governments, and Chinese government has been complying with these kind of international documents and implement at the national level. So I think that will be the space debris mitigation aspect. I think will be very important in the future space maneuvers. But also, I think another very important aspect regarding the deep space exploration. There's no official documents which have been issued, but if we have to look at the China's space activities white paper, this paper was issued every 5 years by the Chinese government. This government mentions that deep space exploration cislunar space is considered to be a gateway for deep space exploration. And what can be done? Of course, first, peaceful use of outer space, but also it promote the international cooperation in the field. So I think that's the two major fields I can think of. One major issue, another issue I can think of is commercialization, which I will not deliberate too much. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it's for diplomats, the input from academia is really welcome. The more cross-cutting it gets, both in terms of topics as well as in terms of cooperation between different types of institutions, I think the more valuable it becomes. I see two big pieces. One is the legal piece. How does our whole complex of international law apply to space, especially in the current security context? I think quite a number of issues have been mentioned this morning that need further hashing out. That will be feeding positions in the UN framework. Not just for us, but for a broader community of practitioners in that sense. And the other, I think, general piece is about what can we do, what practical measures can we take to improve strategic stability in space, to reduce threats, to work with threat perceptions, to exchange on those, and to avoid miscalculation and escalation. We are working on the norms, rules, and principles approach, but any creative thinking, or especially academic thinking, on what will be a good norm, what will be a good principle. We have some ideas of our own, but I really like to be fed by the academic community. Thank you.
Can I just add on that? As a civil society participant for the Open-End Working Group on Paris and all its aspects, that is a 4-year process. We're only in year 1. And I think it's safe to say that maybe member states really appreciate the input of experts to that. Anyone can submit papers to this process. The next time the Open-Ended Working Group is going to be meeting in July of next year. And so they really encourage, it's open-ended, like literally it's open to anyone who wants to participate in terms of submitting papers. So that would be definitely a good place to help, as Marilyn said, give input to the process and help the negotiators have a more informed policy decision so we can have a strategic space that is secure, stable, and predictable for all. Thanks.
Last comment. Just on China and threat perceptions. I obviously I can't speak for the Chinese state, but I would caution against treating it as a monolith. So it very much depends who in China are you talking to at any given moment, which institutions, which offices, etc. Just in terms of my expertise on the military space side, the fact that space underpins so much conventional military power projection for the United States is a major part of the Chinese and the PLA's military threat perception. So it's why much has been spent on counter space by the Chinese, because it undermines the conventional edge American forces traditionally have had. It's not the only thing they're doing as well, but they want to try and do more than just nuke Guam, which, if you want to take apart American military power projection, nuking Guam would go a long way to doing it. It lets you cross the nuclear threshold to do it. Having conventional options to do it, so long-range conventional strike, gives Beijing's decision makers far more options, but you need space systems to get that precision strike without having nuclear weapons to do it. So that's where a lot of military modernization through Chinese space systems of their own comes through. They're not just attacking US space systems. So US power projection in the Pacific still underpins that threat perception for the Chinese, and space is a huge part of that military contest.
Thank you. We've discussed a number of terrifying challenges, but also shown the amount of people and organizations that are working on it, which hopefully gives some hope that we will figure it out. Thank you to the audience for the great questions, the panelists, and to the organizers. Thank you so much.